which is 73, you'll see why I prepare the day of, because then I really have it in my head.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me.
All
I'm
right,
probably
so
too. Anyway, here we are.
here we go. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Laura K. Field, PhD. Laura is an associate with the Illiberalism Studies program at George Washington University, a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and visiting scholar in residence at American University. She is a political theorist by training, and she has written for the New Republic, Politico, The Bulwark, Le Monde, and the New York Times. She is the author of Furious Minds, Making of the MAGA New Right. Would you hold the book up? Because I read mine on Kindle, and so I want you to wave it around.
It
And
is.
we will be, there it is. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm asking you please to subscribe on YouTube right now because that actually helps us out. And to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And to my Substack, it has to be said commentary page at frankschaeffer.substack.com. You may also follow my new project at thegospelofzip.com, which is my new book, and it is both available on Amazon and Kindle and paperback. But in addition to which, I read the whole thing out loud, as most of you already know, on YouTube. And so it's all there, all 8 hours of it for free. So I'm not trying to sell you anything. You can also support our work by making a tax-deductible donation at georgebailey.org. And the book that we're talking about today came out on November 4th, and it will be, as we mentioned earlier, the February It Has to Be Read special book club, because we have booked everything through April, May, June. But guess what? This book is too important to push down the road. We want to do it right now. And so this is what we're up to. So we are, Laura, very happy you're here with us. I told you a moment ago, I read the whole book, have made multiple notes, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for choosing the book for your club. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. So we are going to start by me reading some stuff to you from your own book, and I do something a little different than other podcast hosts and interviewers. Not only do I read the whole book, I do not skim, but I make notes and I like to read from the book. And what I do is I reorder some of the material into a form that I think kind of introduces the subject. So don't get weirded out when you say, but wait a minute, those two things didn't go together. They go together in my head to introduce them, and we can unscrabble it as we talk. So
That
I'm going to
sounds great.
dive.
I'm a very textual person. I'm very happy to hear this. This sounds
Good.
perfect.
So I'm going to
Thank you.
dive right in and open, and I'm not going to do page numbers and all that. This is Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right by Laura K. Field. And here's my open. And I'm going to read a bit here, so this will take a few moments and then we'll dive in. What the writer Matthew Rose says about the radical right is true of the new right, too. Quote, almost everything written about the alternative right has been wrong in one respect. The alt-right is not stupid. It is deep. Its ideas are not ridiculous. They are serious. Its ideas are not ridiculous. They are serious. To appreciate this fact, one needs to inquire beyond its presence on social media, where its obnoxious use of insult, obscenity, and racism has earned it a reputation for moral idiocy. The reputation is deserved, but do not be deceived. Behind its online tantrums and personal attacks are arguments of seductive power. The next little section. In short order, the conservative intellectualism I thought I knew, but had all but vanished from the discourse that dominated the Republican Party. Champions of the US Constitution and of originalism were now sympathetic to a man who obviously cared very little for constitutional niceties and was eventually willing to throw the entire electoral system, the foundation of American government, into chaos for his own power. And the next little section, former defenders of, quote, family values, high culture, and Christianity were suddenly lining up behind an adulterer, purported rapist, and obvious misogynist who was also an anti-intellectual and failed capitalist with a record of 6 bankrupted business. Next section. The letter reads, and of course I'm jumping around here and we can talk about what the letter was. as a religiously inflicted version of Michael Anton's defense of Trumpism, and its title indicates the author took a strong stance against the old fusionist GOP consensus, which is characterized as morally corrupt handmaiden of liberal tyranny. Abortion came up repeatedly. The right to abortion was presented as a result of fetishizing of autonomy and a prime example of liberal cruelty. And the next little section, the movement is in many respects untethered from the ordinary decency and common sense that characterize America and its idealistic best, and from the pluralistic reality of the country as it exists today. Next section, the ideas of the new right have been powerful despite being in many ways untethered from empirical reality. The new right thinkers are immensely successful propagandists and culture warriors who can show the power of cultural politics. New section. Too often, the new right thinkers find themselves in the awkward position of using intellectual abstractions to defend nativism, rootedness, and love of one's own. Too often, the recitation of moral ideology is privileged over the practice of good and virtuous deeds. And too often, highbrow abstractions smother straightforward real world truths about, say, who won which election. Next section. I came to my belief in multiracial, pluralistic liberal democracy slowly. This is speaking for yourself, by the way, back to what you said here, and partly through decades-long intellectual journey through the history of political thought. That academic work informs this book in obvious ways, but I also want to be clear that my own belief in liberal democracy does not come primarily from my study of political philosophy, especially in the Straussian context, which tends to be oblivious both to public policy and post-Rawlsian liberal thought. It comes from my study of constitutional law and of history, especially the atrocities of the 20th century and the wave of liberal constitutionalism that emerged in the aftermath, and from my own experience in the world. Okay, so I've read a bit from your book. And the only other thing I want to say, and thank you for, is that you talk about the fact that a person would have to be an ingrate and a fool not to feel immense gratitude for a life like mine. This is you speaking for yourself again, full of what the Russian Jewish writer, and I can't pronounce this correctly, Nazhada Mendelstam,
Vejda it is.
yeah, thank you,
Mhm.
called the quote, privilege of ordinary heartbreaks and for the political system that makes it possible. Having my own kids, that's what I'm thanking you for because I love people who include their families in their books, as I do in all of mine, okay, end of parentheses, has also made me see the glaring injustices and stupidities of contemporary American life more clearly. You know the list. It includes grotesque and rising economic inequality and the absurd consolidation of economic and political power in the hands of a few. So there we will leave it for the moment and dive back in more, but I just wanted to give people a flavor of what you're talking about before we get into all the specifics. So my first question to you is, how did you come to write this book? And I, obviously it's very topical. But I want to ask you about your own personal journey that's not covered in the book. So, who was your mom? How did you grow up? What did you believe when you were younger? Because you imply a journey to a position you now have with having children. You talk about getting married, having children, and family kind of informed your current view. And I'm just wondering, what did you change from before that information became available to you?
Okay. Yeah, thank you for all of that. You read some of my punchy stuff. But the book, I mean, the book, just so everyone understands, is a book of like about the intellectual right. And so I call it the MAGA New Right, and it's sort of the ideologues behind Trump. And as you
Sure.
can kind of hear from those passages, there's a huge amount of ambiguity on my own part. I think they are serious. I think some of them are very smart, and yet I'm very skeptical and sort of critical of what they're up to. But I think we do miss out if we don't sort of recognize how seductive some of this is. And so my own story connects to that in that I was seduced by many ideas that I today find unpalatable. I never took any political action on behalf of those ideas, but it was kind of part of my intellectual
Mm.
formation. And I don't reject that. I mean, I think young people should be. I mean, I studied political philosophy, and I mean, I guess to fill in the background, I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta. Um, Very liberal family. Edmonton's the seat of government up there, so it's kind of like Austin in Texas. You know, it's
Yeah.
kind of this liberal spot, and that's where the university is. And um, I I was I guess, pretty bookish and nerdy as a kid, but I loved literature and but what I wanted to do was be a doctor in the third world. So I was studying in college to take the requirements for a medical degree while also taking political science because I wanted to be, Doctors Without Borders, and I was obsessed with the, developmental politics in
Mm.
what we then called the third world. Anyway, but I had to take a required course in political philosophy in my third or fourth year, which I had sort of pushed off because I wasn't that into it. And it was really transformative, right? I had these amazing professors. They were conservative, but just wonderful lecturers. And it was this experience. I joke in the book about being red pilled by Plato because these professors were just so
Hmm.
profound. They were asking questions I'd never really heard asked about sort of liberal democracy and democracy in general, but also just about the whole history of ideas, right? And the whole history of the world. And it was like uncovering the key to all of history. I'm skeptical about some of that now, but I'm also still sort of partial to just this to
Sure.
intellectual history for sure, and certainly to the great books, right? Because they sort of woke up something that was dormant in me, which is a love of literature and a love
Mm.
of well, let's just leave it at that. Love of literature and
Yeah.
philosophy. And so from there, I went on and did a PhD in Texas with, again, these Straussian conservatives. We could talk more about what that is, but it's not really important. So I studied with, and there, but at the time I was like conservative curious. I was very politically engaged insofar as I cared a lot about politics,
Yeah.
and I would argue the points. But I wasn't, I wasn't, I have never voted conservative, but it was like the time of the Iraq War. And I remember arguing with my brother about the war, right? And
Mm.
about the weapons and about the strategy and all of that. So I was certainly like happy to have those arguments. And in grad school, I was surrounded by young conservatives. But over the course of my graduate work in Texas, I became pretty disenchanted with just the conservative movement in the United States, being kind of
Yeah.
exposed to it firsthand, and also just reading more about the history of the Constitution and American history. So um, some other I met my husband down there, who's a Democrat from Kansas. That
Mm.
was, I argued with him a lot, and that was kind of useful to me. Um, Anyway, so you fast forward a bit to 2016 when Trump got elected, and I still had this intellectual formation in circles that were very much adjacent to some of the
Mm.
people who really took the lead in the defense of Trumpism, these intellectual defenses of Trumpism. And I was pretty shocked by that. And I just was like, well, for personal reasons, I wanted to do more public writing.
Mm.
And so I thought, well, this is something I can write about. And this is something I have insight into. I kind of understand the language they're talking, and so that's why I started writing about it.
Yeah.
But I was really shocked and repulsed from the get go. I
Yeah.
guess one other thing I'll add about all this is like when I say I've been seduced by some of this, I mean seduced by Plato, Nietzsche, and a lot of these big questions in political
Mm.
philosophy that some of the people I write about are sort of, I think, posturing about. Some of them have deep backgrounds in this stuff, and most of them have PhDs, the people I write about. Um, I think that they're exploiting some of that sophistication in a
Mm.
really nasty way that's not true to the original authors. But I think mainly it's my attachment to Nietzsche that makes me feel a little bit of sympathy with some of what
Mm.
they're
Mm.
they're up to.
Yeah, I'm going to jump into something out of context here again. And just because I want to start with the part of your book, um, one judges things often by what one knows. So if you're describing a landscape in Switzerland, where I grew up in the Swiss Alps as the son of a fundamentalist missionary, and you get some details wrong, I'm going to notice. But if you get it right, then I'm going to trust the rest of your book. So, you sort of go by what you know. And of course, you talk about people like Richard Don Newhouse, who I know well personally. And I wrote a couple essays for First Things when it was first founded, because at that time I was a operative within the religious right and was a go-to person to speak on some of these issues coming out of my fundamentalist background, because my father, Francis Schaeffer, was instrumental in starting the evangelical wing of the pro-life movement back in the 70s and the 80s with C. Everett Koop, who became Ronald Reagan Surgeon General. So I knew all these people. And as a young, hot talent and a speaker, filling in for my dad while he was undergoing chemo treatments at Mayo Clinic, I did things like the keynote speech for the Southern Baptist Convention to 23,000 pastors, filling in for Dad. And then as a result, because I'm a very good public speaker, if I may say so, I got more and more invitations until finally I was asked to be on the board of the Moral Majority. I was asked to be on the board of the 700 Club. But that coincided with my own journey out of both evangelical religion and right-wing politics, which I've written about in a memoir called Crazy for God, et cetera, et cetera. So that's
Mm-hmm.
sort of my history. So obviously I read your book in order, but I'm going to start diving into this section on Christian nationalism because my family had a lot to do with that. And we know, I knew so many people, et cetera. And you write the story of how Trump and Trumpism came to have such deep ties to the charismatic sector of American Christianity is fascinating. Trump was not a typical candidate for the Republican nomination. And if there's one thing beside his frame that smoothed his path to victory in 2016, it was that he had cultivated ties in the evangelical movement for years. His main contact with the was the televangelist Paula White, who, by the way, I don't know and never did meet because we were not involved with the charismatic wing of the church. Now back to you. Taylor calls White the fulcrum on which the epochal shift in American religious politics tilted. And then you say this chapter is about right-wing Christian nationalism and Christian supremacy in the United States. Religion has been a pervasive theme throughout the book already. Okay, so I wanted to then go from that to one specific, and that is just an overarching question I finished when I finished your book, something I just wanted to ask you conversationally, and then we'll get back into the specifics. When you look at J.D. Vance converting to the Roman Catholic Church and Tucker Carlson and all these other people, Ross Douthat, the New York Times, and this sort of group of younger male converts, what would the whole movement of not just Christian nationalism, which has its roots more in the Protestant denominational matrix of fundamentalist Christians combined with the charismatic and going back to Rousseff Rushdoony and all these people who were the theonomists and so on. But it just seems to me that something new that's come along in the Trump era is this kind of hot Catholic intellectual presence informing people like J.D. Vance, who are deeply playing the power game. Not
Mm-hmm.
to mention Project 2025 out of Heritage, which is run by conservative Roman Catholics and so forth. So, just off the cuff, we're having a cup of coffee in an airport, and I'm asking you for an alternative view of American history right now. What would it be if the Roman Catholic connection was not there? And then we'll get into the evangelical thing. And how do you, um, Laura,
Mm-hmm.
see this? Because it seems to me, I grew up where evangelicals were taking the lead in the religious right of the 1980s. And we were kind of helping Catholics out articulate their position on abortion once we got into it. But now, with J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, Ross Douthat, these other people, the Catholic thing is a very big deal. And you have Opus Dei and all this very deeply embedded in the heritage. How do you see all that?
That's a great question. I mean, your background is thick in this stuff, whereas for me writing the book, I had to learn a lot of this stuff and
Yeah,
put the dots together. But I guess how I would see it is that the Catholic dimension, and there's that whole chapter on Vermeule and the Catholics. So the book is kind
sure.
of full of Catholicism without it being at the foreground.
Yeah,
Because I'm focused on the intellectuals, it seems like Catholicism is nothing new to the world of American conservative intellectualism,
yeah.
right?
Well,
That's
going
pretty
back to Bill
steady.
Buckley and then
Yes,
Newhouse who
exactly.
converted. Yeah,
Right. And so that's been very thick in the world I'm writing about the whole time. That's very consistent. But what's new here, I think, is the connection to you kind of have both let's just call it the highbrow Catholicism
hmm,
wing connecting of conservatism, connecting up with the religious right through Trump and his movement.
yeah,
And so they're kind of providing the intellectual chops, if you will, to whatever's going on in a way that the Protestant world has never been especially interested in.
yeah,
Right? But I think what's weird here, or maybe just like a theoretical thing that's interesting, is because so much of what's happening is kind of authoritarian, right?
yeah,
And there's a kind of I think I mean, this is me getting philosophical or like theological in a way that's a little out of my lane, but it seems to me like there's something in Protestantism that's naturally that sort of rejects that authoritarian impulse, a little more, I don't know, maybe not in the actual
Well,
evangelical
the
church today.
charismatics have kind of endorsed it. Paula
Yeah, I
White,
mean, right
they
now,
they see
practically
Trump as a
speaking,
gift from God, but he's sort of an
yeah.
exception.
Yeah, and I just think like going back to Luther, right?
Yeah.
There's something in Protestantism that's a rejection of a certain kind of top-down authority spiritually, is my
Mm.
understanding. So there's something there that the Catholics are coming in and kind of they really, there's some stuff here that's really pushing out the Protestant tradition
Mm.
that I think is interesting, just in how they interpret certain things about American history. Um, Anyway, so yeah, I mean, that's how I see it, is that there's this that I'm right. The book is mostly about these highbrow
Sure.
people, and so a lot of that has a Catholic flavor, or many of these people are actually Catholic, though others are not, right? Obviously, and
No,
so,
of course.
but that the kind of intellectual vector Catholicism pervades that in a way
Do you
that
think that that influence
that it.
within
Mhm.
that movement is why J.D. Vance, for instance, converted and, then gives an interview to Ross Douthat and goes off and meets the Pope at some point, but yet at the same time, his view of so many political issues would make him a kind of an opportunist seeking power of exactly the kind that thoughtful Catholics have warned against ever since the 1930s.
Yeah, I mean, it's impossible to get in his mind, right? But I have this. I mean, he converted to Catholicism at around exactly the same time that he radicalized towards Trump, right?
Yeah,
And so I think that I think it's a mix of sincere religious transformation, but under I wouldn't say the thumb, but under the um sway of certain people like Patrick Deneen and Rod Dreher and perhaps Adrian Vermillion, though I'm not exactly sure, that he had been spending time with and was
yeah,
close with, but then there's also this radical, that's like the Catholic piece of it that maybe explains that particular, his choice of conversion
hmm,
with Deneen perhaps in particular. But I think he was also clearly, spending time with Peter Thiel and invested in all these radical, like the kind of new
yeah,
right energy of the Claremont Institute and all of these other people too. And I think Thiel probably is very important there for inspiring him with this radical understanding of politics and this radical rejection of modern liberalism. I think that's
yeah.
coming from Deneen, and then he kind of gets inspired personally, perhaps, and religiously to convert. But I think it's tied up with these this radical version of Catholicism and
Yeah,
this
one of the
radically
things that I've
political movement.
Yeah. One of the things I've thought about, and I get your opinion on it, and then we're going to dive back into the book, is that when you have Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance and Tucker Carlson sort of all swimming in the same water, and there's a sort of a Catholic mix to that, having been part of the pro-life and anti-abortion movement in the 70s and 80s, one of the things we predicted was the kind of genetic engineering manipulation that Thiel is into, with not only his radical position on more people having babies, but these are going to be genetically tested babies, and these billionaires who are being inspired by Musk to go off and have multiple children with surrogate wives in America with, or surrogacy, not surrogate wives, surrogacy, including a Chinese billionaire that's had 100 sons, having disposed of all the female embryos because he wanted sons. Where this is all ending up, from my understanding of Catholicism, is about as anti and un-Catholic when you attach it to the billionaires and where they're
Mm.
going. That would make Trump's adultery and multiple wives and accusations of rape look like minor inconsistencies compared to, say, the Protestant pro-family ethic. When you look at Theo and where these other people are going, this is straight off out of the pages of Brave New World in 1984. This is the real thing. And the technology exists and they love it. And they're doing this. And
Yeah,
this is the world to which Vance has attached himself. And I know that's a
yeah,
digression, but it's directly related to what you're saying because,
yeah.
I knew Bill Buckley, and he would come and have tea with my dad's chalet in Switzerland because he lived over the hill in Gstaad. And I've known these people for years. If you fast forwarded people like Newhouse and Buckley to now, and you said there's somebody representing themselves as a Roman Catholic candidate for the presidency in J.D. Vance, who's in bed with people proclaiming the
Or
virtues
Jesus, yeah.
of a technology that gets into genetic engineering of a master race, they would not believe you, but if they decided you were credible, they would be shocked that this is where their movement has ended up.
Yeah, I mean, I think that contradiction is a huge and plain one that needs to be exposed. And I don't think it troubles JD Vance, is my impression, or the other Catholics that I write about. But I do think, like, I know that at the Heritage Foundation, I think her name is Emma Waters. I mean, I was speaking to a journalist the other day about the policy there, and they are very concerned about surrogacy and very concerned about all of this genetic stuff, and
Sure.
just like conservatives have been traditionally. And so it's a massive contradiction that JD Vance is right there sitting at the kind of intersection of. And I think he seems to be loyal to both Teal and the Catholic side of this, or whatever Teal's up to. And I think, but I think that the thing that makes me think that they will just keep going with this and just stay on the opportunistic side of it is
Hmm.
that Patrick Deneen, who's one of the sort of
Sure.
leaders of the post-liberal Catholic movement I write about, he came out early in 2025 when there was this big debate about Doge versus MAGA, right? And
Yeah.
so basically like the tech versus the old MAGA. Um, and 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 Deneen wrote this piece for Unheard. I can send you the link. And he basically said, this tension is overstated because JD Vance is our man, and he can basically hold true to both traditions, both the Teal technology side and the Catholic side. Everything's going to be okay. There's
Mm.
not really, JD Vance is our man who will carry us through this difficult these supposed contradictions. And I think that's absolutely like absolute lunacy from a theological perspective when
Sure.
you think about the stuff that but Teal has, he's off there giving lectures on the Antichrist. Who knows what he'll try to justify?
Yeah. Yeah. And he himself, anyway, he's an odd character, but he's a rich one. And apparently JD Vance is so enamored by that road to power that, very much as Tucker Carlson has a fascist Nazi denier of the Holocaust on his show without question, and then people from Heritage quit. By the way, some folks I know who quit. Um, you're in a conflicted situation, but the overarching thing is the same with evangelicals, and that is, well, Trump must be awful, but he's like one of the bad kings of Israel that God still wrote set up, and this is what the Pentecostals say with all their prophecies. Anyway,
Cyrus.
you wrote a book
Yeah.
on it. The New Right movement has materialized under the first Trump administration and then grew in power after January 6, 2021, was in many respects hard for American liberals to see and appreciate. I thought this was so well put. This was partly because the movement was given cover by Trump's anti-intellectualism, and partly because liberals and establishment types too have difficulty conceiving of perspectives and worldviews that differ so significantly from their own and seem so outlandish and extreme. And I just wanted to, and you call it these blind spots also concern religion. The early 21st century was a time of spiritual turmoil, realignment, and de-alignment in the United States, and it took some dramatic turns during the Trump era. So you're one of the few writers that I've interviewed who seem to get this, and you talk about it quite often in your book in various ways. And I'll give you one anecdotal evidence of this. Way back when I was on the Today Show with Jane Pauley back in the '80s, in which I was talking about the kind of way what we called the secular media had ignored some of the best-selling books my dad had written, who was also an evangelical intellectual that would have been part of this. And one was called A Christian Manifesto that had sold 1 million copies, and I happen to know had sold about 10 times more than the number one bestseller on the New York Times at that time. Well, not only was it not reviewed, it didn't exist to the elite media or the academic community. It's like whatever those people over there are doing, has nothing to do with us. Well, fast
Mm.
forward to the present where, the Times now is covering religion and they're, oh, no, no, all about it. And they've got these articles, coming out all about it. And of course, I had been writing for the last 30 years saying these guys are coming like a freight train and nobody had been paying attention. And now all of a sudden everybody's paying attention. So what you're writing about in your book is not a secret history. This book,
Not at
a big,
all.
big
Yeah.
chunks of your book could have been written 20 years ago. And in terms of some of these people and where the
Mm.
movement was going. So let me get into something that's not specific to your book, although it is, and that is what is this kind of myopic academic slash media point of view as it keeps replicating. And I'll give you an example now. They keep talking about, well, it's all about the economy. It's all about the economy. And there's no honest discussion of the kind of moral revulsion against the sexual revolution in the 70s and the 80s that is still with us and energized all these people at Heritage and all the rest of it. Um, so how do you figure that? You're someone from that community. How do you figure the fact that right under their noses has been this incredibly radicalized community? They've dismissed them all as kind of ignorant fools and not paid attention to the intellectual wing that you write about so well in your book. And all I can say is it's about time someone took it seriously, and you are. So well done, you. But where's everybody been?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty puzzling. My own angle into this is through academia almost exclusively, right? And so um, it seems to me like all of the trends in academia have been for since the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, which I'm a big fan of,
Yeah,
have been sort of critical. And there's been feminists in these gender studies departments, and there's critical studies in literature. And that when I went to college, that was definitely the dominant flavor of
sure.
everything. And I think that's all well and good, but at a certain point, it gets stale, and B, it leaves this huge vacuum for just sort of normal everyday bread and butter education about history, about
Yeah,
and sort of a more constructive version of history. I don't mean uncritical, I just mean like basic facts, right?
yeah,
And just like and contested facts for sure. And all, but there's and then just like for me, the traditions of our inheritance of great books, and I mean
sure.
comparative literature, I mean a very wide open canon,
Yeah,
but that not that sort of the foundations of our culture, our pluralistic liberal culture, right, are just completely neglected, and nobody's really doing that basic work of civic education and of just basic sort of liberal
yeah,
education. And
yeah,
so that vacuum has um, contributed to some of the frustrations of people on the right, and many conservatives, the Catholics, well, um, whether it's Opus Dei or whatever, they've got these institutions they've been building alongside the high institutions of higher education. They've been trying to preserve some of this stuff, but and they've been writing screeds about it for 100
sure.
years now. But they've kind of been ignored, largely because they've also been so ignorant about and so dismissive of things like civil rights and feminism that it's hard to
Yeah,
take them seriously. So you get this, but what you get, I think, is a real insularity, right? So in
yeah,
the institutions in higher education, you get these insular pockets of conservatives who are kind of completely far removed from the just normal practices of like peer review. And then
yeah.
you don't really get much questioning of the status quo in the rest of academia, where people are pretty happy and they're doing good work, but it's not there is this hollow vacuum, I would say, in the liberal arts
Hmm.
and just general education. And so you have this massive problem, and then I mean, and then I'd say you have a kind of series of historical contingencies, perhaps accidents that and real problems that allow you've got sort of a stagnancy on the left in terms of it's just basic awareness of anything and a kind of
Yeah.
taking everything for granted, blended with these historical contingencies that bring these people into power, and suddenly you have a huge problem on your hands.
Yeah. And the funny thing is, just coincidentally, I've run into this attitude in a number of ways in my lifetime. First of all, we were very famous, very influential, and a very big deal in a microcosm subculture being the white evangelical community. But, like somebody who's a rock star in a form of music you don't go for, you've never heard of him, then you meet people like who think he's a very big deal. Well, we were like that. So I kept running into that. And then the other time I ran into it is when I coincidentally wrote a book on my son going into the Marine Corps at the beginning of George Bush's ill-chosen wars in the early 2000s. And after 9/11, he'd joined the Marine Corps out of high school as a kind of a lark. And then after 9/11, of course, it became very serious. And my book that he and I had written, which became a bestseller after Oprah had me on, was called Keeping Faith, a Father-Son Story About Love in the United States Marine Corps. And
Wow.
I've been a successful author. I've had bestsellers, 9 languages. And The Guardian called one of my novels the best first novel that was published in the UK that year, et cetera. So I have some chops. But my agent got 23 rejections before 9/11. And then the day after, she got literally 20 offers because it was like, oh, didn't you have a book about the military? That thing
Yeah.
those other people do. And then he was out of a private, swanky, bilingual French English high school in the Boston area. He's the only kid from that school that's ever been in the military and living time.
My
And
God.
and then this and parents would say, well, what went wrong? Why my liberal friends, so Volvo driving, higher education worshiping, North Shore Boston people would say things like, well, what happened? As if somehow he had gone in because he had
Right.
drug dependency or something, because no one they knew served. So I have had this weird experience in reading
Yeah.
your book of a kind of a been there, done that deja vu of being in, first of all, a military family in a very non-military area where nobody volunteer. I mean, maybe go in as an officer if your dad was a general or something. And then also the evangelical thing. So, wherever you talk about the blind spot and the kind of ignorance in the establishment, the kind of people who, and I voted for Obama too, but sort of accepted that as a normal thing, not realizing what the backlash would be. Um, I don't think in the kind of non-military participation of people from that class volunteering or the non-church participation, I think the big mistake on the academic left has been to underestimate the absolute fury that ordinary Americans, not just conservatives, have with that perceived elitism, whether it's real or not.
So I
And
agree completely.
this has fed the whole movement you're writing about.
No, I completely agree. And I mean, people have said to me, um, I do not understand how somebody could vote for Trump a second time. The
Right.
first time, fine. But honestly, to me, when I look around and I see the Biden administration and the lying there, right? And or the hiding or whatever that was,
Sure.
and I have no problem, and the elitism and just the way people operate, and I'm
Yeah.
part of the elite, obviously. I mean, my God, but like just the close-mindedness and just the complete detachment from reality. I'm not talking about the economic stuff. I'm
Yeah.
talking
No.
about the kind of spiritual stuff and the dismissiveness. It's mind-boggling to me, right?
Mhm.
And I think it has to do, I mean, I could go on. I think it's the Ivy Leagues and just like the way the money works on the East Coast and all of this stuff. I mean, I barely understand it, and I'm
Yeah.
repulsed by it. Um, Even though I'm around it all the time, right? And I love a lot of these individual people who are obviously
Yeah.
part of it, but it's
Sure.
like it's so cloying, and I think so what we're talking about though is a kind of cultural insularity and a failure of the whole country to and the Democrats are much more well-meaning and at least trying, in their
Yeah.
smug way to deal with some of this stuff, but like there's no I mean, Patrick Deneen writes about this project of mixed constitutionalism, right?
Yeah.
And I think he's got this recent book, Regime Change, which I find the
Sure.
whole thing pretty absurd. But on the policy questions, that he's talking about this Aristotelian idea that you need people in a community to get to know one another across class lines and across.
Yeah.
And I thought, yeah, that is right. That is what we need. We need more people in the military who wouldn't have been. We need a national service program so people from different parts of the country can get to
Yeah.
know each other. We need a massive, cultural exchange program in our universities, and we need to pump a ton of money into our public universities and
Yeah.
colleges, so that I don't know, to take some of that power away from the Ivy League. I mean, there's just a lot there that could be done. But again, there's very nobody's talking about this on the Democratic side. Nobody seems to even notice that it's a problem. I mean, maybe they do. I don't really understand what they're up to, but I find it very difficult and frustrating to
I
see.
mean, the weird thing is, and I promise you, I don't usually self-promote in this way, but what you just did is outline why I wrote my new book, The Gospel of Zip, because that's what the book is about. It's
Wow,
everything
really?
from my experience as a young married teen, looking at a world now where people aren't even dating some of the times, let alone having committed relationships, let alone having children. And then the fact that literally some of my best friends in my neighborhood are Trump voters who put big signs outside. But I talk about how my dog Zip, is so happy to see them anyway. And I am too. And they're my
Hmm.
neighbors and that kind of cross fertilization. So having lived in not just both camps, but various camps which all seem to hate each other, and then the kind of basic human
Yeah.
connection of longevity, which all the science studies say, by the way, is much more important than taking vitamins or exercise or smoking or not smoking, is whether you have wonderful connections with community, with family, with all these people. I've written a whole book about it. And of course, I draw on that experience. And that's what the Gospel of Zip is about. And one reason I put it online for free on YouTube is I really wanted to break through the barrier of people who don't read when
Mm-hmm.
university presses and people publish your stuff. So I
Mm-hmm.
put it in short sections. Okay, that said, I want to jump back into something here very specific to your book, which
Okay.
I found really terrific. You write, in other words, the Jeffersonian liberal vision is all around us. It is like the water we swim in, and that we take for granted, whereas these other views needed to be recovered. Those are fair points, even if they were absent from his original talk you're talking about. Crenshaw was undoubtedly correct in mainstream liberal context. The pluralistic or secular liberal account is dominant, sometimes to the point of excluding good historical arguments about American Christianity. The deeper question lurking here, though, concern the present. Which vision of America, the Christian or the pluralist, should be embraced and celebrated today? So you sort of lay that out as a question, but in terms of what we've just been talking about, how diametrically opposed or ignorant of each other these groups are, how do we get to a place where your question would be even fairly considered rather than the immediate reaction being, well, how do I make my side win? How do I
Mm.
take these idiots down? And one of the things, and I said it earlier, that I so appreciate about your book is the respect with which you approach the intellectual chops of these right-wing luminaries who are brilliant people with PhDs and writing, and they're the people that Tucker Carlson, JD Vance, Thiel, and these others are reading and following. And you kind of outline who these guys are. And I learned a great deal, by the way, because that's not part of the movement that I have expertise in,
Right.
although I knew who they all were. So this is just kind of a basic philosophical question as an observer to you. How do you see any potential for anyone becoming like my dog Zip, who walks up the street and is happy to see anyone and takes them, face value
Mm-hmm.
without worrying
Mm-hmm.
about who they voted for?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think the good news is that a lot of people, like, I think in our actual daily lives when we're not stuck online, that is how we are, right? I mean, people can go to the grocery store and they're not fighting and punching each other because
Yeah,
we, there's a kind of, there is a decency to the American people, in my view. I mean, I know it feels absurd to say that given what's happening right now in some cities.
yeah,
But I do think that I think, I mean, partly why I wrote the book is because I think the stuff that's going on in these ideas worlds is way more radical than
yeah.
what ordinary Americans want, what most Trump voters really, I think if they knew, I think that, I don't know that they're going to read my book, but like, I think that the more this stuff becomes known and the more we see how this is unfolding, people are seeing like, no, this actually is radical. This is something that I don't stand for. And so, I do have, I have long-term hopes, for all of this. I think that in the shorter term, or in just, in the abstract, it's almost harder than out on the streets with your neighbors. I guess that's
Sure.
what you're pointing to. But I think one thing we need to do is just sort of be a little more direct about the problems and a little more
Mm,
willingness to engage one another directly,
yeah,
even though that means disagreeing and being, and having contestation and
sure.
really just disagreeing and getting more used to that activity of disagreement, because I think there's so much, for very many reasons, the political culture is not that used to actually engage. Citizens aren't very used to engaging directly with
Yeah.
one another. Um, and so one thing liberals can do is just be a little more open to actual argument. And that sounds so cliched, but I think a lot of what's going, you know, um, we've taken so much for granted, and part of being willing to argue is just also being willing to be direct about these problems and the fact that
Mhm.
they exist. The fact that
Yeah,
there's a kind of mm, um, I talk in the book, as you know, about this kind of, it's not a moral vacuum, because I think liberals are very moral people. They're often
yeah,
very self-righteous people, right? But there's a kind of vacuum in our capacity to talk about big questions and
yeah.
them and meaning. And I mean, I could write another book about why that is from a political theorist perspective, because of the kind of problem of liberalism and how liberalism refuses to tell us how to live our lives. It
Why
is the
don't you
water
write
we're
that book
swimming.
so that
Well,
Democrats can start winning
I mean,
elections?
maybe, yeah, I would
I'm
like to,
being
but I think,
serious.
yeah, I mean, it is, I think, a book I would like to write, but there's this kind of theoretical and lived um, almost allergy to talking about questions of meaning, right? And
Yeah.
I think that there are historical reasons for that. But it's time to confront them, right? And it's
Mhm.
time to be more engaged. I think there's more room in our if so long as the pluralistic side that I delineated there wins out, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I am on the, I think, 250 years have passed since the founding, right? And it is a pluralistic country. To go down the route of Christian supremacy would require a huge amount of coercion and
Yeah.
force,
Or racial supremacy,
or
same
right,
thing.
whatever, all of
I
these
mean,
things. So
good
I think
luck with that.
I hope we're on the pluralist path. I think we can stay on that path. I think that's our
Yeah.
reality. And so, but what that I think there's still more room for religion in public life. I'm a
Yeah.
little hesitant to say that because I don't, I think that somebody maybe more from your perspective or certainly from an atheist perspective might think that that's naive, and what that actually is going to involve is
Mhm.
Christian supremacy. But I think that it's time for people to and I don't know, I'm not sure I'm persuaded that religion has been shoved out of public life, but I'm sort of sympathetic to that argument. So I mean, I think there's a lot that could be done, but I think the first thing to do is just to kind of find a way to wrap our heads around this problem in
Mhm.
an honest way. And I'm talking about like, the problem of meaning in modernity, right? And the fact that people are getting there. Um, I think that if we don't sort of become more comfortable talking about that, then our young people are going to be getting their advice from Jordan Peterson or
Yeah,
from
sure.
whoever, from sources that um, aren't that
Yeah.
serious. And we could be doing a whole lot better as a country in sort of at least showing young people all the different possibilities.
What you just said about sort of taking a harder look at religion was something that I heard in an interesting context on another interview I did a few weeks ago with Petra and Alessandra, who are up for an Oscar for this documentary they made called Apocalypse in the Tropics, which is about the whole civil war that took place, basically a civil war in Brazil over a 6-year period, with the charismatic church, often influenced by American leaders, coming to the fore and putting a prime minister who's now doing a 27-year sentence for trying to assassinate and have a coup. And then Lula came back in again after Bolsonaro was out, who was the candidate of the charismatic church in Brazil. And when they interviewed him after he was restored to power, in terms of what mistakes did the left make to help create the situation, his actual quote, which I remember verbatim, was, he said, the biggest mistake we made was by not making room for religion in our ideology. And so
Mhm.
basically, he spent time in prison as a political prisoner. Then he was released. Now the other guy's in jail. Their parliament was stormed
Yeah.
completely and invaded, which made our January 6th thing look like nothing. Then their
Yeah.
generals conspired with the current leader at that time to do a coup and kill him. Now he's back in power. So what happened in Brazil was very influenced by the American charismatic Paula White wing of the church, going all the way back into the 1950s when Billy Graham went there, and they've been getting more and more and more evangelical and less Roman Catholic. So we had a very interesting discussion
That's
because,
fascinating.
and then just again, the current president of Brazil, who is a left-wing socialist, non-church person, said our biggest mistake was not including religious people.
Yeah.
And he ascribes that as the principal reason for their very near civil war and coup, bringing all the generals back again because the church felt so disrespected. So it really
I
ties
did
in with
not
your
know
book.
that. That's
Yeah,
amazing. Yeah.
yeah,
Like, I
yeah,
do
and
think
that
it's a hard line to walk because it all comes down to abortion, right, and women's rights, and
sure,
I'm not turning my back on that, right, for me personally, but
yeah,
I do think that you got to be able to have people in your life and in your party who you just disagree about with some things.
absolutely.
It might not be you might still I'm still going to fight for a certain policy plank, right? But you've got to be able to live with people
Hey,
who
there were women who
and
wanted,
respect them.
there were Democratic left-wing women who were anti-abortion, who were prevented from speaking at or walking in the
Yeah.
Women's March after Trump was elected. And all I can say is this is, how did that work out for you?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm there with you, even though, I mean, I don't like saying so because it pains me because I sympathize a lot. I mean, I do believe in women's rights,
Well, so do I.
to
I'm
their body. No, I
pro-choice,
know,
and
I
I
know,
was
I
on the
know, I know. It
anti-abortion
makes me
side, and
crazy. No, I know, but I
not,
think if you can't wrap your head around why someone would be anti-abortion, I do think that's, I mean, I get it.
yeah. Yeah. So
So,
let me get back to your book again. But we're having too interesting a conversation. The Claremont Institute. Explain the Claremonters. The Claremont Institute was founded in 1979 by some of Jaffe's students. For Jaffe, the American regime rested as much on a strong moral consensus as it did on a religious freedom. So you talk about some of these groups and some of these people. So let's hit them one at a time here. Who are the Claremonters? What's all that about?
so the Claremonters are named after the Claremont Institute in California, which is a right-wing think tank that was founded in 1979.
Yeah,
That and they're committed, and they were the first to take on this Trumpy intellectual project, basically under
yeah,
this guy Michael Anton, and they stand for the restoration of the principles of the American founding, but with the caveat that only as they understand them, and they have a
yeah,
very exclusive way of understanding the principles of the American founding that's very rigid, and I think is sort of a small government outlook that rejects the New Deal and is against the administrative state, and so some of that stuff has informed the Doge and the destruction of the administrative state
yeah,
under Trump. They've it's also been, I'd say, corrupted by paleoconservatism, right? And so by this sort of nativism. So there's a kind of tension there. I mean, we're talking about the contradictions of this movement. These guys were inspired by a Lincoln scholar named Terry Jaffa, who's a big moralizer
sure.
about equality, and now they're sort of at the foreground of fighting, birthright citizenship. So I mean, it's full of contradictions, but that's this one
That's who they
important
are, as
vector.
is the whole movement. Okay, so
Yeah.
next, Journal of American Greatness. As a window into the New Right psychology, Michael Anton offers an especially useful case study because he is both bookish and online, and because he is uniquely obsessed with the idea about women and masculinity, which opens up an enormous subject. So go there a little bit for us. Well, and first of all,
Yeah.
what's their problem with women, and what's this whole masculine shit, and all the rest of it? But talk about these guys for a while.
Well, okay, so Anton is the sort of big Claremont guy. He was in the second Trump administration. He was ousted from the first one, but then he got into he just, I think, finished up the big national security strategy report. He was basically the author of that. So if you think these people aren't, don't matter, he's like, exhibit A for
Yeah,
having, made this leap into power. I use him as an example because he's got this very weird background, and he's from the Claremont School. He fancies himself sort of a Machiavelli scholar, and he loves Tom Wolfe, the novelist, but also
sure.
is a acolyte of somebody named Harvey Mansfield, who is a big, important conservative scholar at
Yeah,
Harvard, and has been at Harvard for, he's 90 something years old now. And so he figures in my book because he comes from that sort of intellectual strain of Straussian political thought that
yeah,
I come
yeah,
from. And I've known about him my whole adult life. And so he wrote this book called Manliness. And anyway, Anton's kind of been obsessed about gender stuff for a long time, so far as I can tell from his records online.
yeah,
And I used him a bit to kind of show that there's this kind of mm, anti. It's I've been I sit I I basically say it's not casual misogyny on the right today, on the conservative right. It's a kind of intellectualized misogyny, and for me,
yeah,
Michael Anton really represents that, and so does Harvey Mansfield a bit. I mean, cast his first vote on the Harvard faculty against the creation of a women's studies department
yeah,
back in the 60s or whenever, I don't know when that was. But and so there's something here that is very, thick in the conservative intellectual circles, and I wanted
yeah,
to capture that. It's been completely bizarre to see how extreme it's become. I don't think Harvey Mansfield would support this, the most extreme misogyny and what we're sort of seeing develop on the right today, but I'm certainly not drawing any kind of direct line to that. But
yeah.
But it's certainly pervasive in some of those circles.
Let's
And
talk
I
about.
mean, I tried in the book to include some women. I thought, well, who should I include? Who are the important female or women figures in the intellectual movement on the right? And there just wasn't really
Well,
anybody
there
who
was one
had
that
that
I
kind of
knew, and
stature.
one I knew back in the day was Phyllis Schlafly, and she was
Right.
pretty.
And I'm,
She was a smart woman, and I knew her personally and hung out with her for a while.
yeah.
But she's not of this generation.
Yeah, and I was trying to look for the Phyllis Schlafly in the word, and there isn't really someone. There are activists, there are people in the movement, obviously, but nobody's taken that seriously and has nobody has acolytes who's a
No.
woman on the right.
Talk about post-liberalism. And you say this chapter is about Patrick Deneen's political thought and actions, the transformations these underwent during the first Trump administration and the early days of post-liberalism and American Catholic integralism, also sometimes called neo-integralism. Deneen's core argument is in why liberty failed is that liberal democracy is doomed from the start because it is based on the destabilizing philosophical premise of individual autonomy. Okay, just to pause there, that's something I sort of agree with. I don't mean how he put it, but my whole view of communitarian connection and loving your wife and taking care of your babies and doing all the childcare I do for my grandchildren, by the way, three of the youngest
Mm,
who live in my neighborhood, I too do not regard autonomy as my number one value. I regard connection, compassion, love, care, sacrifice,
hmm.
suffering for others. These are things I was brought up on with a Christian value, but and I'm no longer an evangelical, but I don't like the idea of individual autonomy being the
Yeah.
kind of lodestone of our development, and I see that in Elon Musk. I see that
Yes,
in Peter
absolutely.
Thiel, and I don't
Yeah.
like these guys at all. And
Yeah.
they're not heroes to me. They're losers because, they don't have the relationship with a woman that I have because he's off having babies with 12 different people with 15 kids to populate, whatever. In other words, talk about this autonomy thing, but let's get into, what's wrong with post-liberalism and where they err, because I don't
Well,
think
yeah. I mean,
autonomy is
I'm
there.
very sympathetic to all that too. And Patrick Deneen kind of has an ecological bent too, where he's interested in,
Yeah,
how modern life, consumes the world and tries to control things, right? Like there's a lot there. There's a lot there to like. And he does
sure.
have a communitarian background. And but I think what he's attacking here is sort of the political. He's got an extremely sort of straw man way of understanding liberal democracy that's really taking a hammer to something that certainly needs some tweaking, right? But what he's saying is that sort of the whole liberal tradition is flawed from the outset because it's based on this idea of the individual person. And
Yeah,
I can agree that embrace of the individual autonomy and the individual freedom certainly has some sort of dangerous propensities, and certainly historically has led to a place now, especially in liberal economics, where this atomization is a problem, the failure to also contend with, to hold on to a community and to cultivate community, all of that I'm behind. But he's sort of from a causal perspective saying it's inevitable with liberalism
yeah.
once you have something like human rights or privileging an individual person in that way, it's just going to fall apart necessarily. And I think that is very dangerous and
Hmm.
wrong, right? There's no reason why, as free individual people who come together in a political community, we can't also choose to cultivate community. We can't also band together and make things happen, in community and with it, with our, like, there's no necessary connection there that but he makes this very hardened case that's kind of drawing on these reactionary Catholic traditions. Okay.
Yeah,
And so the post-liberal movement in general, and I also talk about the neo-integralist movement, which is
yeah,
caught up with Adrian Vermeule, and that's in chapter 10. Basically, what they have become, or sometimes neo-integralism is described, or post-liberalism is described as just a sort of whitewashing of integralism or a rebranding of integralism.
yeah,
But what integralism is, and I think it's important to understand this, it's a pretty radical movement to basically reject the Catholic Church's settlement with liberal freedoms, with religious freedom and
yeah,
pluralism. Okay. And so the
yeah,
Catholic Church has kind of made its peace with liberal modernity and said we can we're going to live in a liberal democracy with people from different religions. And there's a big, this is like Vatican II, or something, right? I don't know this with history as well, maybe you do,
Sure.
but they've got a new way of interpreting these documents, these statements on the part of the Catholic Church that says, no, we don't actually need to. We can. There's a different way of interpreting. I think it's Dignitas Humanae. It's one of these
Yeah.
writings that means that we can actually sort of reorder the state towards Catholic ends. And they speak quite explicitly about like basically infiltrating the bureaucracy through with and restaffing it with Catholics
Well,
or
that's
with
Project
right thinking
2025. And
people.
of course, that's
Yeah.
happened to the Supreme Court. Who do you think they are?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I don't think the I don't think the Supreme Court in our country actually has been infiltrated by neo-integralists. I think that's the kind of thing they're envisioning, even though
Yeah,
they're
no,
Catholics on the
that's
court.
their
You know what
aim.
I mean?
Sure.
So it's like, but that's the way they talk. It's very radical. It's a total overhaul of modernity, and they've got all of this fancy argumentation to kind of make that happen, and some strategies as well. And JD Vance is very close with them.
Yeah.
Adrian Vermeule is a Harvard law professor. I mean, I am not talking about people who are are just like fringe on the sidelines. They are people with tremendous amount of prestige in our country. We're talking about the vice president,
Yeah.
and very well connected people. So, I mean, that it's very radical, but it is this effort to kind of rewrite the future away from the liberal tradition of um,
Yeah.
that gives some real respect to the individual choices of people, and
You
instead
say,
takes a top-down approach
yeah, you
to
right.
morality.
Deneen took two important themes within liberalism and reduced them to an essence. By reducing liberalism in such a way, he avoided engagement with liberalism political forms, the limits it imposes on government, the importance it places on freedom and self-government, and its connection to Christianity and the Protestant Reformation. He treated liberal democracy as rigid ideological program, but what we call liberalism today is highly variable historical phenomena. I don't know if you've read Tom Holland's book, Dominion. He's the leading British historian of ancient Rome, and he also co-hosts the podcast The Rest is
Mm.
History with and which is the most successful podcast in the world now.
Wow.
And he talks about the fact that you can't really understand Western liberalism unless you understand the power of Reformation Christianity, which kept questioning everything. And he says, of course,
Yeah,
atheism is the logical conclusion of Luther if you play it out all the way to the end. And
sure.
so he says, Western liberals who think that the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment and Voltaire and Rousseau and these guys were doing something new. Actually, they were comparing the church to what they thought of as the actual teachings of Jesus, and their quibble was the hypocrisy of it all. And
Yeah,
so
sure.
he looks at the modern liberal phenomena of gay rights, gay marriage, feminism as a natural outworking of Protestant logic of first questioning everything, but also this idea of Jesus is that you concentrate on the least of these, the weak will be vindicated, that it's not all about the strong, sort of the opposite of an Elon Musk type. So I don't know if you're familiar with his
I'm
work.
not, but you know what? I think the Catholics I write about would agree entirely with that assessment. They would just
Yeah,
say, and it's terrible, and so that's why we have to take the reins and turn things back.
yeah. And so, okay, First Things is the foremost Christian periodical, and I knew these guys. National Conservatism, Thiel, you talk about this, and you talk about the first American National Conservatism Conference took place in Washington, D.C. So just address some of the historical landmarks of where these guys have kind of made these quantum jumps. All of a sudden, Tucker Carlson's involved, and now we have J.D. Vance, you know, and Trump is sort of, okay, we don't like him, and he's not one of us, and he's certainly not an intellectual, and he's surrounded by thugs, but he's helping to open the door for ideas we like. So talk about that, the difference between these intellectual powerhouses that you respectfully talk about, and then the way this is being used in the Trumpian context, and how their intellectual life work is informing something that on the surface is the diametric, at least aesthetic and intellectual opposite of themselves. In other words, whoever thought that, the people you're talking about would be informing a movement that includes people like Paula White
Yeah,
and the charismatic Christians, which couldn't be further away from these guys. I mean, these guys are
I know,
never going to
right?
have a drink together.
No, no. I mean, maybe at the fringes, but yeah, I mean, so basically in the book, the first half is about the kind of early days coalescence of the movement, the creation
Right.
of some of these new conferences, the organizing, the different people coming together in these weird ways. And then January 6th was this moment where um, John Eastman of the Claremont Institute was involved in the actual legal memos for Trump, to
Yeah.
get Trump, for Pence to not certify the election. These Claremont guys were hyping up the idea of election fraud. And then there were the charismatics too, right there on the Capitol. I mean, it's this
Right.
huge event. But I thought after that um, Trump would, the whole thing would just fizzle out. I didn't think it would keep, I thought it would be the end of it.
Yeah.
And instead they kept having these victories, these leaps, as you say,
Well,
into,
and they keep folding people in that you would never imagine, like Yoram
yes.
Hazony. Like, what's
Yeah, well,
Yoram
Yoram Hazony was
Hazony?
there from the beginning, basically, but it's a
Nat
very
Khan.
odd character, right? Because he's an Israeli American, and now we see some of the cost of some of this, but I can get to that. But the second half of the book is sort of showing them in action and the real consolidation of the movement and their continued ascension. So you've
Yeah.
got there's floating policy ideas. You've got this stuff with Rufo and the anti-CRT stuff, and the stuff in Florida with DeSantis trying to do the education policy in Florida. You've got JD Vance getting
Mhm.
the nod. That was an
Sure.
incredible victory for them. And then you have Project 2025. Oh, and during that period, they also just took over a lot of mainstream institutions. So you've got the Heritage Foundation very explicitly going over to the NatCon side of things, and they hadn't been during the first administration, but
Yeah.
in after under the Biden administration, they did. ISI, this other place, sort of went over and got radicalized. And then there was this also just a proliferation of new institutions that kind of flourished under the Biden administration on the right. AFPI is one. Stephen Miller has this legal fund. There's all this sort of activity and motion
Yeah.
happening. That I think, again, Trump sort of was a camouflage for all of this. Nobody really believed that it was happening, and nobody believed that any of it mattered. And then they did Project 2025,
Yeah.
right? And people weren't willing to even take that seriously, even though it was all sitting there, right, very explicitly. So they kept having these victories and these big sort of moments for themselves. And I guess just one other dimension of this that I think really matters far more than liberals are sort of primed to think about because of their wonkery and their sort of technocratic
Right.
sensibilities. The culture war stuff and just the extent to which this stuff has permeated certain parts of the sort of the manosphere and beyond, right? And how it's
Sure.
kind of percolating. I mean, there are two chapters I don't think we'll have time to get to, right? But they're what I call the hard right underbelly, where it's just like all of these really bizarre, basically fascist figures some
Sure.
of whom are Christian, some of whom are, there's the Calvinist guy, and then there's these sort of pseudo Nietzschean guys, but they're huge. They have huge followings.
Yeah.
They're very keyed in with all of the different people
Well,
I
and no
write
matter
about.
how extreme they are, once in a while, Tucker Carlson will interview them or somebody like
Exactly.
that.
Yeah, he invites them on all the time to his news show, and he had Alexander Dugin, who's this Russian fascist, on. I mean, and all of this crazy stuff. And so, that stuff's pretty dark, and I think it's not like Joe Rogan is the same as the like hardcore fascist people I'm
Right.
writing about, but it's sort of percolating in those worlds, and it's affecting, I think, the kind of the spiritual mindset and the ways in which young people are being formed, right? It's not happening in the universities, it's these young men watching YouTube. And so I think that's really important. And it's the staffers on Capitol Hill. And it's like that's how you explain these crazy DHS tweets, right? And Pete Hegseth and the crazy rhetoric, right? But it's more than rhetoric now. It's also these people it's ICE on the streets feeling like they
Yeah,
have to
because Pete
cooperate.
Hesketh is one of these guys, but in addition to which he says he's an evangelical Christian and he has all these white supremacist tattoos and you
Yeah.
know, he's ready for the next crusade. I want to ask you a question and then get back into your book because I do want to cover a couple more things.
Okay.
But I have a question. How direct do you think the line is from the January 6th insurrection to the ongoing siege right now in Minneapolis and what actually ICE has turned out to be, which is this sort of private, intimidating army that's picking up citizens and shoot some woman in the face and so on? They're looking increasingly like a secret police who are these guys in reference to these intellectuals? In other words, when you look at J.D. Vance, forget what he says in public about, these people have total autonomy and can do whatever they want in the name of whatever. How did they see in other words, I understand the justification for electing Trump twice as a kind of an end game. Okay, he's keeping the door open for Heritage Foundation's Project 2025 and our program and, getting the right justices to the court and so forth. But, it's not lost on me that a lot of the gun lobby all through the 80s, 90s, and Biden administration was, we have our guns to protect against federal tyranny, when masked flak jacketed Gestapo operatives get into the street and start shooting mothers in the face, we'll be there to defend you, which was always the kind of paranoid vision of the right. Now, ICE is doing this for real. And of course, these people are utterly silent and saying, good, time to pay these people out. No problem shooting a woman in the face or a mother because, we don't like women anyway. And I know I'm being cynical, but that's kind of it. But
Mhm.
I'm going to ask it again. How direct a line is there from the January 6th insurrection to the ongoing siege in Minneapolis and the kind of development of ICE as this private militarized America? Is this what MAGA saw themselves voting for? And how do the intellectuals you talk about in your book with their foundations and think tanks square with this, which would seem to be the opposite of anybody's idea of what you want in the streets?
I mean, I think they're caught up in the excitement of domination, right?
Good
And
point.
so I think that that's why they're on the side of the rioters on January 6th. And
Yeah.
they think, and they're certainly on the side of ICE, and they think that they are. That's why I think it's not just about opportunism and power. I think that they're caught up in the excitement and in the kind of titillating spectacle of it, and in their sort of resentful hatreds, right? Of,
Mhm.
they talk about the elites and the regime, and Curtis Yard. They have all these different, like, all this different language to use for their hatred of liberal elites. And you and I have already talked about our simple. We get that there's a
Sure.
problem, but I guess that's how I think of it. But I do think that I mean, the basic story is that any old barriers to sort of fringe violent extremism have sort of gone away on the
Mhm.
intellectual right. And so I think now we're sort of seeing some of the consequences of that, where they've
But
been.
your chapter from the alt right to the hard right, you say this chapter is about the ugly underbelly of the new right, which was formed in a large part by a group of men who profess passionate admiration for all things Spartan, Bronze Age, and Homeric, and who were cultivated in, quote, manly layers like the Claremont Institute. They used to be fringe characters on the right, but began making serious inroads into mainstream Trump's victory in 2016. Under Trump, the far right American underworld came up for air. Sparta had an ugly, nay, grotesque underbelly too, etc. So you kind of get into this, and I think brilliantly in the book. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you've written the explanation of my question right in that chapter in terms of glorying
Hmm.
in this kind of Spartan.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, we're talking, these have become cage fighting fans in a writ large,
Yeah.
but for real too, in terms of the
Yeah.
president, these other guys.
Yeah.
So just go into that a little bit because, um, you know, for having a son who went and fought in Afghanistan and Iraq a number of times and back in the early parts of that war, when I think about the training he got in the Marine Corps, about the strict guidelines of what a war crime was and what you don't do, and you never carry your weapon into the civilian public and so forth. The kind, it isn't that America has become militarized in the sense of the kind of drill
Mm.
instructors that were training John, my son, weren't telling him this sort of stuff. They were telling him the
Hmm.
opposite.
Hmm.
And so, how have these people, this kind of Spartan fan club of, Roman, Greco, whatever stuff, plus Sparta, that seems to me
Yeah.
very much what Miller is about. And when I look
Yeah.
at these ICE guys operating, they obviously aren't looking to Marine Corps training of the difference between civilian and military action. Who are these people? Where are they getting the energy from? And how does your discussion of the intellectual backbone of this movement fit in with this? with your Harvard
Yeah.
professors
I
and all
mean,
the rest of it.
I think that the intellectual side of it shows you that, I mean, part of it's that the people I'm writing about, they're posturing, right? It's like this, it's a kind of LARPing manifestation of these like drives that they feel, and then they go on Twitter and they write their Bronze Age mindset book, and they're excited by that, and it makes them feel very strong and big, and they're and it's exciting, right? But I think what we're seeing now is sort of on the ground reality of people who take those things into the real world, right?
Yeah.
And who feel like they have an excuse for that, partly because they're reading this stuff, this hype online that sounds very serious and highbrow. And so it kind of, I think probably there's it helps presume, I mean, I don't know that these young men who are part of ICE are actually subject or reading to,
No, they're
this
not. They
stuff.
never even heard
They're
of these
not, but some of
guys.
them might. Well, but you just don't know, right? These weird blogs and everything. I mean, this stuff is pretty pervasive. And so
Yeah.
I think it's, I'm not trying to say there's any direct cause, but I think it's kind of the melange. It's this sort of what's going on online,
Yeah.
and then what they feel justified in. But because a lot of it's just basically that in the most highbrow versions, it's saying we are the ends we seek. Maybe their spiritual salvation in the Catholic Church, right? For
Hmm.
all people and the common good. That's how some of these people talk. So I think it allows people to feel like whatever they're doing is justified. There's a
Mm.
sort of, I mean, permission structure is sort of how we often talk about it. But I think it's this mix of the excitement and then the kind of permission that it gives them. I mean, what you're saying about your son and that strict regimented life is, and how different that is from what's happening on the streets, is so
Absolutely.
powerful. And I think that I feel this, and when I was writing, I get so disgusted with some of these, especially the fascist guys who like Bronze Age pervert or Curtis Yarvin, who are sort of walking
Hmm.
around swaggering and about all this, and just because, I've been thinking, I've been thinking about how, I've given birth twice, right? This
Yeah.
is not, it's not a huge big deal, but it's like, it can be really scary. It's extremely painful, right?
Yeah.
I found like it was really,
Yeah.
really hard, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not really in control of it, but whatever. So, but you just see these assholes online, right?
Mm.
Posturing like this as if they've been to battle, and like most of the people I write about, they've never done anything hard physically in their life so far as I can tell, except for
Right.
maybe, bench press a little bit, and it just makes me
Right.
sick.
Right. Right.
It's so unserious, it's so juvenile, and it's so sort of hateful towards basic decency in life.
Hmm.
I mean, I think you and I are on the same page in just our
Very
utter
much so.
revulsion
Well,
for
and
some of
then
this
you
stuff.
write about the hypocrisy. You say soon a clear paradigm emerged in which people who were the most adamant about the extremism of the 2020 summer, which was the riot,
Mm.
the demonstrations and riots related to a black man being killed, were also the most dismissive of the January 6 attacks. So basically, they're ready to justify anything. And if you can justify January 6, then what's shooting somebody in the face? No problem.
Yeah, there's one guy named Sohrab Ahmari who I have some sympathy with because he's stood up against the hard right at times, and for other, I just think he seems to have some integrity. But today he's out there tweeting about how we need how the government has to just lay their foot down so hard on these people in Minneapolis,
Yeah.
to sort of set an example and educate the people. And he uses this highbrow terrorism language, and he called the January 6 riots a cornpone intifada.
Yeah.
That's how he
Wonderful.
referred to January 6th. I mean, what a joke.
Yeah.
It makes me so mad.
And they're not serious people. And I contrast that with my son's experience in the Marine Corps. You have a whole chapter that I thought was excellent. I mean, they're all excellent, but one I don't want to blow by too quickly here, which is laying siege to the institutions. This chapter chronicles the New Right's efforts to seize and reclaim American institutions, starting with the anti-CRT campaign and the legal changes it affected. So just talk a little bit about what CRT is and what you're talking about.
Yeah, so this people will probably remember this sort of what I would call an anti-CRT craze, the anti-critical race theory um campaign that sort of started, I think, in 2021.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty calculated thing that a guy named Christopher Rufo, who I think probably everyone's familiar with by now, Christopher Rufo made it his personal project to use this term, which is a kind of, I mean, it's a standard term in academia in a way because it's been an influential way of thinking about the law. The basic idea is, well, it comes from legal studies, and the idea is that you can have that a law might be on the face of it colorblind, but still have racial implications that are profoundly racist or
Yeah.
unequal. That's the kind of the basic area of analysis. And so this has been influential in all kinds of all sorts of academic spheres. And so Rufo came along and said, "I'm going to make it such that first of all, everyone thinks that CRT is being taught in elementary schools. So the claim is basically that the elementary schools are teaching that the laws are all racist, right?
Hmm.
And he says this is good. And he's going to say CRT is being taught everywhere, and he's going to use that phrase. He's going to turn it into a catch-all phrase for everything everyone hates about woke education, right? Or about wokeness wasn't so much the term then, but he tried to kind of bundle it all together to make it a good, useful talking point for
Hmm.
politicians.
Hmm.
And Trump got in on this, and then Youngkin, I think, was one of the first people in Virginia to campaign on that, and it became this whole thing where, I mean, and now they're rewriting, they're forcing people to rewrite their syllabi so that they don't refer to certain terms like critical race theory and um, gender studies. I mean, so it's had this huge impact in higher
Sure.
education and turned into this just basically censorship campaign. And it was built out of, I wouldn't say it's nothing. I mean, CRT is a real thing. It has had some influence, but the idea that all of elementary school and or like K through 12 education had been sort of taken over by
Yeah.
critical race theory is utterly absurd.
Yeah. It's
And so you get this kind of, it's kind of like I guess the right would call it the AstroTurf campaign, right? Where they're just really going for it with their propaganda and having a big impact, right? Even though
yeah.
they kind of know that it's not exactly fair. I mean, he's been pretty explicit about just how much of a liar he is.
Yeah.
There's a New Yorker article where he admits that he's just trying to manipulate things.
Yeah. I'm going to get to this in a second. We're going to wrap it up, but I just wanted to say that your book, I'd like you to wave it around and read the title and subtitle again.
Okay.
I
Thank you
mean,
so
this is
much. It's
really
Furious
the
Minds: The Making of the MAGA New Right
yeah, and I
with
would just say
Princeton
this.
University Press.
Yeah, and I would say to my listeners and viewers, I often talk about a book being ripped from the headlines, but I'm going to put this differently than I usually do, and that is that Laura's book is the explanation of the headlines in a way that no one else has written about so far. It's way overdue. You talk about the intellectual chops of the right and left-wing people who discount it all as conspiracists and anti-vaxxers are idiots themselves because these are very serious people with a long-term program, often well-financed. And then attached to power seekers like J.D. Vance and Elon Musk of the kind I haven't seen in my 73 years. I mean, no hold barred, do anything, go anything, say anything, accept any lie, parrot any lie if it gets you a little further down the road. So I'm going to ask you to read something from your book to conclude here, and then I'm going to ask you a favor um, that I may forget to repeat after you've read it. When we sign off here, please stick around and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, for a minute to A, help us set up the book club, tie into everything you're doing with appropriate links, and also to give him any names for future guests you would recommend of people you have a
Okay.
personal connection with that having talked to me for an hour and a half, you'd say, oh, you would enjoy talking to so and so, and we might not know who they are. So please pass on any names from all your many travels and connections. And then if you'll go to your book and find the conclusion here that I think is, where is it? Um, I think it's pages 319 and 320, but it begins with the words to the anti-liberals and others on the post-liberal right who say that we are already there. The liberal tyranny and oppression is already mainstream. I say, you have lost your way. And then it goes
Okay.
to and ends with the words, different outlooks should be our watchword. Curiosity is a good one too. So do you
Okay.
have the passage I'm talking about?
Hmm. Couple
Would you mind
paragraphs here.
reading? Yeah, would you mind reading that?
Okay,
And is that appropriate for me to cite as sort of your conclusion?
sure. I mean, it's part of the conclusion, and I mean, I go on for a few more pages, but this is
Well,
a
you
good
can read it all.
excerpt.
As far as I'm
No,
concerned, you
God, no,
can.
no. I've read the audiobook, right? So if people want to hear me go on and on, you can get the
Yeah, but I'd love
audiobook.
to
It's
hear you
12
just
hours.
read that section and
Sure.
end it anywhere you want.
Okay, okay, sounds good. Okay, so this is actually following a passage where I quote Christopher Rufo, who's saying how we need to reclaim, we need to be able to talk about the purposes of our institutions again,
Hmm.
right? And I say, if we can't do it, no one will do it for us. I say they won't, nobody else will, and there will always be plenty. I'm just going to start a little bit before to get the context, okay?
Sure,
Yeah.
please do.
There will always be plenty of people eager to impose their order on us or willing to send us careening back into pre-modernity, and not just its purer waters, but its storms of ideological conflict and bloody strife. Okay. And so when I, and so, okay, here, I'll just go for now. Okay. To the anti-liberals and others on the post-liberal right who say that we are already there, meaning in this world of strife and catastrophe,
Mm.
um, and that say that liberal tyranny and oppression is already mainstream, I say you have lost your way and should walk with more care. You take the liberal world for granted too. This has allowed you to don the language of grievance and oppression far too lightly, without having given enough thought to what oppression actually means. The kind of oppression that doesn't let you love who you want to, or vote in free elections, or not be disappeared. It is unseemly and it is unmanly, and some of you will miss your liberalism when it's gone. To liberals and progressives, the message has to be different because the problems are different. They have less to do with gross state violence and disregard for human decency and more to do with what Jonathan Rauch has called coercive conformity, or what Tocqueville called soft despotism. It is not a general problem, but a rather narrow one, having mainly to do with insular academics and elites. Whatever we call it, when it comes to this subset, conservatives who complain about liberal intolerance have a point. If deep moral pluralism is to be a modern liberal aspiration, and I think it must be, then all liberals must cultivate a hardened but steadfast toleration for worldviews that we find incomprehensible, deeply offensive, or dangerous. We do not have to like it, and we do not have to be sweet. As Sarah Schulman has written, conflict is not abuse. But we must do it as a matter of intellectual integrity, a guard against the tyrannical drives that lurk within, and a pledge of humility and hope for a truly diverse future. Maximal accommodation for different outlooks should be our watchword. Curiosity is a good one too.
Yeah, and I love the book, and I'm glad we end there because there's a kind of, I wouldn't say an optimistic note there, but you write as if you think there may be a future. And as a mother of several children, who are how old, by the way, now?
10 and 7.
Okay, well, you have a stake in the future.
Yeah. No, I'm very hopeful for the future. I mean, the book tries to end on a hopeful note, and I'm very hopeful, and I'm hopeful about the American people, right? I love this country.
I do too.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really moved talking to you. You're just a lovely person, and I love the person that comes through the book, and meeting you in person has increased that. So I just want to thank you for being who you are.
Well, thank you so much. What a pleasure to talk with you.
Mm.
I hope I can come back and talk to your book club.
Every week.
Okay. Okay.
That's
We'll
what's
figure
going
something
on.
out.
And write that
Okay.
book we talked about because we
All
need
right.
it.
I'll try. I'll
And
think about it.
stick around and talk with Ernie a little bit.
Okay. All right.
We'll do anything in our little way to help get people reading your book. I love it. It's so important. You want to understand the headlines, read this book.
Thank you. Thank you for
Talk
having me.
later. Yeah,
Okay.
much love. Bye-bye.
All